Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Rural Progress Summit. I'm State Representative Anthony Daines, the Alabama State House Minority Leader. Before we turn it over to my friend Doug Usher, I wanted to start by acknowledging yesterday's U.S. Supreme Court decision that forced Alabama to redraw its state congressional maps. Doing so vindicates our belief that it is the right of voters to elect their candidates of choice, who best represent them throughout the state of Alabama, in both our largest cities and our small towns. So Doug's presentation couldn't come at a better time as we discuss the partisan balance in rural America over the last decade. Now I'd like to introduce Doug. Doug has spent the last 2 decades building insights that have helped change the strategic trajectory of major corporations, industries, associations, and political campaigns. Combine deep expertise in opinion research, data analysis, and analytics with years of expertise and experience navigating the intersection between business goals and political policy and regulatory spheres. Doug has helped build winning strategies for campaigns and for clients across a broad range of industries, with a particular focus on pharmaceutical and energy sectors. Prior to joining the FTP team, Doug worked at Purple Strategies, Whitmire Communications, and the Melman Group. Doug lectured widely on the changing nature of measuring public opinion and sentiment, conducts seminars for the United States Department International Visitors Program, and has served as an expert witness for the U.S. Department of Justice. Doug, welcome to the Rural Progress Summit.
Thank you, Leader Daniels. I really appreciate it, and congratulations on that, wonderful victory at the Supreme Court. Well deserved. I really appreciate the introduction, and am very excited to talk with you today about some research that we did internally, but also results that are coming up that I think help to show the growing challenge for Democrats in rural America, but also some of the opportunities we see. And so some of you have seen some of this data before. I think we've had some great news recently that shows where we can go. And so just to get started here, I want to give a sense of, to be honest, how dire the situation has gotten for Democrats in rural America. And I think we need to understand where we started. I was introduced to this effort just a few years ago, and was frankly shocked to see what I found. And no one had done this research before One Country Project had the opportunity to do it, to really take a close look at what's going on among rural voters by looking county by county, not just looking at a crosstab on rural or urban or suburban, but actually looking at the individual counties and the data that came in. What you see right here is a graph going up to just before 2020. These are presidential election results going back to 2000 and going all the way through to 2016. And what you see each line represents for 5 key states, the Republican versus Democratic advantage in rural counties. And you see we highlight here what has gone on in just one of those states, which is Pennsylvania, which is that the Republican advantage increased from about 20 points to close to 50 over the course of just 16 years. These are numbers that we don't see among any other demographic group. You cannot pick a demographic group going up and down the line that has, over that short of a period, moved so much of their support from one side to the other. There are other groups that are the base of parties. Obviously, African American vote among Democrats, evangelical Christians among Republicans. Those have been consistently on either side of the vote. But in a lot of ways, the realignment of rural America is so dramatic, it looks a lot like the realignment of the South with Nixon's Southern strategy. That's the closest example we can come to it. That was leading up to 2016. Now, there was good news in 2020, which is to say, if you look at the 2020 vote and Biden's victory in 2020, he didn't get back rural voters, but he stopped the bleeding. Each of these graphics here show you a little bit about what happened among different groups. So starting from the left, if you look at Democratic-leaning suburbs, they continued their trend towards Democrats. That's a reaction to Trump from 2016 to 2020, going from a 20.6 advantage to a 25.6 advantage. And then you go look at Republican-leaning voters, or suburbs. Those suburban voters moved more towards Democrats. And again, a reaction to Trump. Urban centers, interestingly, stayed just as much an advantage for Democrats as before. But if you move to the right, take a look at this rural county. So the slide before gave a long-term demonstration of the trend in key states. If you look nationally, just between 2012 and 2016, Republican advantage increased 13 points, from 20 points to 33.5 points. In 2020, Biden stopped the bleeding, which is incredibly important. You can't reverse huge trends in one election, but stopping them there was critical. Okay, but that's not enough. And I will show you, importantly, in a second, about why losing in rural votes has a dramatic effect on our ability to hold the presidency. We had, over the course of the last 20 years, two sets of parallel elections. Okay, and I just want to go through this because it's a little bit of math, but it also is incredibly illuminating. Let's start on the left side of this chart. In 2000, Al Gore won the popular vote by just a hair, about half a percentage points. And that turned into 266 electoral votes. We don't need to relitigate Florida. Obviously, if Florida falls the other way, it's the same vote with even more electoral votes. 16 years later, Hillary Clinton won by a bigger advantage, 1.6 points. That's a huge number of votes. Yet their electoral votes declined by 39 points over 16 years. Why? It has to do with how we've done in among rural voters, and how our dispersion of votes is actually working to hurt us. With a 2-point advantage, we only got 227 votes. Bring that forward, and if you look in 2012, Barack Obama won his re-election by 3.9 percentage points and got 332 electoral votes. That translates in 2020 a 4-point victory, so by even more votes, to 306 electoral votes. So again, the distribution of Democratic votes are losing state after state after state, watching them go away because we don't have support among rural voters, and because rural voters were turning out at a greater pace, means even Joe Biden winning by 4 percentage points, he gets 26 fewer electoral votes. And you can sort of translate this out, which is we start at a disadvantage. That is true of all of the states, which is to say, because the states are, and you look at the Senate, it becomes even more problematic. So that's just to reinforce the importance of having more strength among rural voters. Let's take a closer look and think about 2022. Obviously, this is 2020. This day and age in politics, if it happened more than 12 hours ago, it's ancient history. But I want to point out a couple of other critical things to think about as we look at 2022. And what did we learn from 2022? And a lot of numbers here, but I want to, again, we have to think about the numbers here if we're going to solve this problem. And we've got two examples, and this is a great parallel: Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, right? Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, two states that went from Trump in 2016 to the Democrats in 2020 to Biden in 2020. Pennsylvania was a seat that flipped in 2022 from Republican to Democratic. Wisconsin is the state that did not. The top part of this slide looks just at how Democrats did. So between 2016 and 2020, the rural Democratic performance improved in Pennsylvania from 25.8 to 27.1 points, a 1.3 increase. In Wisconsin, it also improved from 37.6 to 39.4%, right? So improvements in both, as we talked about before, Biden, Democrats stopping the bleeding. But what happened between 2020 and 2022? In Pennsylvania, Fetterman was able to improve on Biden's performance by 2.6 percentage points. All right. By contrast, Barnes in Wisconsin did not improve at all on Biden's performance and, in fact, declined on Biden's performance. Now let's take a look on the Republican side. In Pennsylvania, Trump actually improved slightly on his performance in 2016 by 0.9 percentage points, but again, stopping the bleeding, about the same. Democrats improved by 1.3, Trump improved by 0.9 between 2016 and 2020. So again, about a wash. In Wisconsin, right, things improved 2.6% for the Republican side. Obviously, fewer candidates, fewer votes going to third-party candidates. However, Republicans and the Republican performance in the 2022 election race improved by another 1.7 points, right? By contrast, Republican performance in Pennsylvania in the Fetterman race declined from 71.5 to 67.2%. Again, these are not margins to write home about. We're not excited to lose any group by 37 points. But these incremental performance improvements, right? In this case, the net effect for Fetterman was close to 7 points in rural voters. That makes all the difference in the world. By contrast, the net effect in rural votes in Wisconsin actually went the wrong direction. So started moving back towards where you are. Where we were. What's the outcome in both of those? A victory for Fetterman and a defeat for Barnes. Look, you can't win only with rural votes, of course, and you don't want to put all of your energy into them. But making these margins go down a little bit, and as all of those who sit on election night and watch those red counties come in, it's one thing that they are small. It's another thing that they're coming in with a 40-point, 50-point, 60-point advantage for Republicans. That's where we don't get enough votes to make up for it when it comes to the urban, suburban areas as well. I'd like to move along from federal elections to look at beyond the federal elections to give a bit of a demonstration in Wisconsin of how we can actually improve our performance. So again, walking through Wisconsin was a bad news story in 2022 based on the data we saw when you compare the Biden result in Wisconsin in 2020 and the Barnes result in 2022. In Wisconsin, as we recall, Biden won a slim margin over Trump. Evers as well actually improved on his performance between 2018 and 2022, right? Going from a 49.5 to 48.4 race all the way up to 51.48. And again, getting off of that presidential race, you have a gubernatorial candidate who did do better, and he did better in rural votes than he did before. And then importantly, taking a look at the Supreme Court race, and Protasiewicz, and pardon me if I got the name right, Protasiewicz, ended up with 45% of the vote in rural Wisconsin. Okay, so comparing that again, just to go back for a minute, to rural Democratic performance was 39 points in 2022, an improvement of over 6 points. Again, not the same partisan, but clearly people were voting in partisan ways in that Supreme Court race. You can see improvement in these rural vote areas as we get away from top of the ticket some of the branding issues that may be problematic for Democrats. And then just to go to the next case that I think is very important for us to consider as we move forward is take a look at Kansas. Right. So in the presidential election, Trump won handily by 15 points, right, overall. If you take a look at the gubernatorial election, Governor Kelly won again. Schmidt did a little bit better this time around than Kobach did the last time. He was obviously a problematic candidate. But then we turn to the abortion referendum, right, where the no vote was good for those on the pro-choice side. And the rural vote was 48% in Kansas on the pro-choice side of that election. So again, you can see that we clearly have trouble in rural areas overall, and there are states that are quite red. But we're also seeing opportunities or little glimmers of hope or green shoots that happen as you get beyond the presidential level, as you think at least a little bit about the quality of candidates and their ability to appeal beyond traditional Democratic constituencies. And you're seeing as you get the furthest away from some of these issues, meaning you get away from a presidential race, right? National Democrats. You get away from a Senate race, which of course has a little bit more of a state focus, but certainly gets caught up in national votes. You even get away from a gubernatorial race, where even though it's the state, you certainly have a partisan piece, and you get just to an issue. You see what we've seen for years, which is that on specific issues, there are a lot of rural voters that are on Democrats' side. But our problem, of course, is one where we've lost such touch with them. The connection between rural voters and the Democratic Party has been so weakened, and I'm sure you've talked about this many times for a whole host of reasons. But as you get away and get back more towards the issues themselves, you're seeing real opportunities everywhere in America, right? And that, I think, is an incredible lesson to learn as we're starting to rebuild and claw ourselves back in rural areas that have been so problematic and have really, we came in, and one country came in, I think close to 4 years ago and started this fight, I think with some success, but these are really the start. This is the start of something that has to happen. So I want to go through a few findings, if you will, some key takeaways as we take a look at these data. The first is, and I think we have to admit it, when you have a problem, first thing you need to do is admit it. The Democratic brand is damaged in rural America. And importantly, it's damaged in parts of rural America that we need if we're going to win, right? It's one thing, again, thinking at the presidential level, to have, problems in rural areas, say in South Carolina, although that's a place where we eventually can challenge, and other parts that have been pretty deep red on presidential levels. It's another thing that we have such problems in rural areas in Pennsylvania and in Michigan and in Wisconsin and in states that are critical to us winning, right? So this Democratic brand weakness, if you will, creates an instant barrier with voters. And even when they were with us on the issues, you see a presidential campaign has so much work to do to break through that piece. As you get closer to the voters, it becomes a little bit different. And Leader Daniels, of course, can talk about his success across the state for Alabama Democrats, but that's as you get away from the presidential level, right? Stopping the bleeding was enough to elect a Democratic president, but we need to do more. We have put ourselves at a disadvantage. The thumb is against us because we have lost so much in rural America. It's basically because of federalism, because of the Constitution, because of the structure of the Senate. If you give away rural areas, you are putting yourself where you need to overperform in other places. You need to get, if everything stays the same, if the distribution of votes to stay the same, you need 4 points in the national vote to win a presidential race. leave aside the Senate. We do see a lot of how candidates matter. I'll say, there's not that much evidence that, the magic candidate is going to turn things around in a presidential race anytime soon. But stopping the bleeding, which Biden did, was the difference between winning and losing. And candidates matter. Literally US Senate races are being decided based on candidates' ability to appeal and get that extra 4 to 5 points in rural areas. And I will say, and this is an opportunity thinking forward, there could be wins for the taking with initiatives. I'm not suggesting an initiative strategy, off the bat. However, we do have the data that show that people may not like Democrats, but they like a lot of what we do. Initiative politics, which has, I think, in many red states in particular, been used to the advantage of the conservative side of our politics. I think there's tremendous advantages or tremendous opportunities on the more progressive side. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. Happy to answer any questions that people may have as we go forward. And of course, we'll take other questions too if anybody has them.
Well, thank you, Doug, for that valuable insight on kind of the landscape and helping us forecast and look forward, and really help us start to have more conversations about what it's going to take to move the voters in rural America and to begin the process of not allowing ourselves to look at rural America as flower country. But stopping the bleeding is important to the success of any statewide race, because an example of that was the Doug Jones 2017 special election, where we played into areas in rural Alabama where it may have been 80-20 in the previous election, but we were able to take it down to 65-35. And so focusing on the edges while the candidate themselves focus on the actual urban and suburban areas where they're able to communicate with certain voters. And so there is a question in the chat. I will tell you, one person said, how do you think racism affect the Barnes versus Fetterman performance?
I'll be honest. I'm sure that race is involved with every piece of what goes on in our politics. There's just no question about it. It's also the case that Fetterman is more a person of rural America coming from a different part of the state. So I won't deny, won't say, well, it's not racism, it's the quality of the candidate, and that doesn't have to do with race. It definitely in part had to do with race. Clearly, the campaign's effort to pin Barnes to unfairly or not, to defund the police and some of those issues as well, helped to, hurt him. And they're both black and white candidates who are winning and losing across the racial divide. So I think that race is clearly an issue. I think it most likely is also issue focused and questions of him being of urban rather than not of urban parts of Wisconsin. I would not discount the issue of race with that at all. Having said that, with all of that, of course, you see the victory in Georgia and see at least a little bit of wiggle room for rural America and more red states to elect black senators, black elected officials.
And to add to that, as an elected, I do think that it's important that we start building the infrastructure in rural America so that, we won't have to have the conversation about race having an impact, because you wouldn't allow the race to be close anyway. If you're able to stop the bleeding, the race will never be close. And so I think that oftentimes we also get ourselves into issues that certainly will be used against us in the future. And so we got to make certain that we're very risk adverse when we're dealing. We know that we have future ambitions. And so we just got to manage that appropriately and deal with issues that impact working class people and stay in that lane. and not adopting necessarily an agenda from another state that may not work in your state. So I do think that race does have a part in it, but I do think that we have to broaden our base. If we know that, then broadening our base should be sort of an issue in working on working class issues that impact the pockets of Americans. And so those are that's just me from an elected standpoint, where things that I see on the ground here in the state. Another question from the audience is, what was Biden's appeal to rural America that helped him stop the bleeding?
Great question. I think it's both a combination of his biography, right? He definitely was able to position himself as as someone who came from the working class. Certainly, his whole career has been devoted to this, and I won't separate it from race either. Right? There might be a way in which there were enough rural voters who felt more comfortable with Biden. Now, having said that, that's compared to Hillary Clinton, so there can be gender issues thrown in there. But if we just peel away for a minute some of those if you will, simplistic ways of looking at how folks evaluate candidates, I mean, there's always some truth in that as well. It's clear from day one, everything Biden says, he talks about working people, right? Everything he does, everything about him, everything about the way that he talks to voters, every speech he has. And to be clear, they also include reference to Black Americans, also includes reference to LGBTQ. He did not shy away from that. He did not shy away from from civil justice issues and civil rights throughout his campaign. He did not shy away from talking about George Floyd. So the combination of that, it still was also the case that his working class roots, and as Leader Daniels suggested, that he was able to connect with folks in a way. And again, just to be clear, it's not even to get 40% of the vote, it's to hold on to 30% of the vote and stop the trend that had happened that was a 25 to 30 point drop over time.
So another question that we have here is, we can continue to peel off voters away from the GOP, but how would that take? How did that help us flip seats, and what has been happening to get us there?
So let's just think about 2016 for a second, which is to say, two things happened that were unimaginable, I think, or to those who are going into the election, so for the Democratic side. One is that rural performance would dip as low as it would. And two, rural vote for the Democrats would dip as low as it would. And two, that rural voters would turn out as much as they would. Right? Look, I'm a data guy, but that's been the flaw in analytics and the way we do high-tech analysis of data. There's always a thing that we don't predict. That was what was so ruinous. And I think how we turned it around was, number one, pulling, I think, some of that vote back and stopping the bleeding. But in a lot of ways, in 2020, Trump may have helped us as much as anything, which is to say we might have peeled back a point or two or kept the rural votes where it was, but turnout in suburban areas and in urban areas returned back to 2012 levels, where they'd really fallen down in 2016 levels. So to the question, it's definitely peeling off and limiting the damage in rural America, winning back some votes, but improving turnout. And I mean, again, sorry to use the obvious case study, but Senator Warnock's performance, in election after election after election after election, is an example of what you need to do to just keep enough to win, but bring out folks to vote.
Thank you. And before there's another question here. How has polling changed? The last question, how has polling changed since 2016? And how do you think people's opinion of polling will impact the 2024 election?
That's a great question. I think polling stinks. It's part of what I do for a living. But I will say polling is never, I'll quote a colleague of mine, it's never been easier to do a poll and never been harder to do a good one. And so the fact that it's so easy to do a poll means it's flooded with polls of varying accuracy. I think our job as consumers of polls is to realize they can tell you one of three things. one person is definitely going to win, the other person is definitely going to win, or we're going to find out on election day. And I think if we just could finally get back to that and realize, just like we don't get to predict, the future, it's kind of in God's hands. And, we have to work really hard, but don't sit and look at Nate Silver and try to predict the future, because polling can tell if it's going to be close and help us build strategy, but it's not going to tell you who's going to win or lose.
Well, all of our virtual audience, I would say to everyone, let's give our friend Doug Usher a tremendous virtual round of applause for providing this very valuable information, very insightful. And I just hope, Doug, I certainly hope that as a party in general, we start building back the coalitions in rural America and start communicating economic policies that impact them, or kitchen table issues, as they call it, that impact families, and being able to unpackage what we've done for them so that they understand what we've done for them and make their lives better, so that we can get back the territory that we ceded and not fought for. And so thank you for your insight, and thank you for providing this valuable information. Next up, one country board member, Representative J.D. Scholten, will moderate a panel discussing the future of media in rural America. Thank you, and we'll look forward to seeing you in the next session.